After streaming live these Sunday Masses last year for the first 2 Sundays, one of my good friends pulled me aside and said, "Father, why don't you consider acquainting yourself with some makeup? This way, when you are watched and listened to on YouTube or Facebook Live, your forehead isn't so shiny." And thus, about a year ago, less or more willingly, I purchased a small box of makeup powder, and ever since, before we start rolling the cameras, I apply just a little bit powder on my very high forehead in order not to blind any of you here in the pews or watching us on YouTube and Facebook Live. I have to say, applying makeup to my very high forehead is not my favorite thing, but it does hide some of the very profound wrinkles. I call them thinking or philosophy wrinkles on my forehead. There is something to be said about the modern culture in which we tend to hide away all the imperfections of our bodies. Instead of big glasses, we now purchase contact lenses or get eye surgery to fix our vision. Now, my sister will not go outside of her home without high heels and, of course, a lot of makeup, even if she's going to gym or swimming pool. But I am wondering, what do we lose when we take all these steps that have as a goal hiding our imperfections, our wrinkles, and yes, even our scars? What do we lose in the balance as we apply makeup literally or metaphorically? In today's gospel, the resurrected Christ is appearing to his disciples on the lakeside. He tells them, "Peace be with you." But initially, his disciples do not recognize him. John says they thought he was a ghost. And finally, Jesus decides to introduce himself by showing his wounded hands and feet. He says, "Look at my hands, look at my feet, that it is I myself." And the apostles, knowing very well what happened on that Good Friday, how he was nailed to the wood of the cross with big nails in his hands and in his feet, immediately recognized that this is indeed the risen Lord. They realized that it was not a ghost, but Jesus the Christ, by the wounds, by the scars that he carries on his feet and his hands. You see, the power of the resurrection explodes in the life of the apostles only after they look at the feet and hand of the risen Lord. The power of the resurrection, the transformative power of death and resurrection of Christ, can be experienced by us as well. when we recognize the wounds that exist in our lives, in our personal life and existence, in the life of our church, and in the life of our country and society at large. Yes, we can deny any scars, any wounds. We can deny their existence. We can apply a thick layer of makeup, literally or metaphorically, on the wounds of our past, on the wounds and sins of our nation, on the wounds and sins of our church, on the wounds and sins of our own lives. But that makeup, that denial prevents us from being transformed by the power of the resurrection. Every therapist will tell you that you cannot start the process of healing until you name and address that wound that caused you so much pain. Until you name it, until you recognize it, until you own it. In South Africa, after the demonic apartheid system was abolished, they created Peace and Reconciliation Commission. And that commission very carefully and painstakingly named and addressed all the atrocities, all the wounds, all the scars that existed in their lives because of this satanic apartheid system. Perhaps we need such a truth and reconciliation moment in our life of the church, of the nation, and my personal life as well. Perhaps we need to name and recognize the scars that exist in our life as a church, as a nation, as a family. Pretending that we are just fine, that our country is doing great, that our church has moved beyond the scandals is simply denial, is simply applying another layer of makeup on the scars that will continue to bother us and our children. Denying that the church has wounded and scarred countless women just because they are not males. Denying that the church has wounded and scarred countless LGBT siblings of ours. Denying that the church has wounded so many young people by their own ministers will not lead to a new resurrection and spring of the church. Only acknowledging the wounds and sins of our church, we can move on and experience the presence of the risen Lord. In the same way, we can say that until we recognize, name, and own the wounds and scars of our nation, we will not be able to start the process of healing. The sin and the wound of racism and slavery, it is still showing up its ugly head so many years later, needs to be named, recognized, and owned by us. We have to say "We have sinned, O Lord," and the wound is bothering our nation and will continue to bother our nation until we name it, we own it, and we beg for forgiveness. In your personal life, you will never be able to live to your fullest potential until you recognize the wounds that you carry with yourself, that you have carried perhaps for years or even decades. Some of these scars and wounds may be of your own making. Some others could have been caused by your family member, your friend, your neighbor, your church, or your country. But until you look at your wounded hands, until you look at the scars on your psyche and on your body, you will not be able to experience the transformative power of the resurrection. My friends, as we continue our journey through this Easter season, Jesus the Christ, the risen Lord, comes to our lives offering the gift of peace and healing. And that Easter peace, that Easter healing comes from his wounded hands, from his wounded feet, and from his wounded and broken heart. The peace that all of us can experience when we recognize the existence of the scars and wounds in our lives, in our personal history, and the life of our church, and in the life of our country. And if you want to be honest with yourself, not all of the wounds and scars are signs of sins, personal or societal. Some of the scars we carry on our faces, some of the wounds and scars we carry in our lives are simply signs that we have lived well. Someone said that wrinkles on your face are simply a sign that you have laughed. That gray hair on your head are simply a sign that you cared. And the scars on your heart, on your body, and on your soul, they are simply a sign that you lived. I invite you to experience the transformative power of the resurrection by looking at the wounded feet of Jesus the Christ, at his wounded hands and heart, and recognizing that you too carry those wounds with you. Let us ask God to heal us, to heal and transform our church and nation, and to bring us all the peace that comes from the resurrected Lord. Amen.